The rotten wooden door of the Red Fern Diner creaked under my hand, drawing in a gust of wind that smelled of dust, gunpowder, and old regrets. I stepped inside, searching for a glass of water to quench my thirst after so many miles of travel. Water, I said softly, my voice hoarse, my hands shaking with fatigue. The man behind the bar, with a greasy apron and eyes as sharp as barbed wire, stared at me. Just a cup, he asked, then added, "Are you a traveler, just passing through?" I replied clearly. "Yeah." He nodded, poured water into a cup and slid it toward me. When I tried to take it, he didn't let go. "Name, Ellie Hayes," I replied. The room held its breath. A man sitting nearby leaned back in his chair, his eyes searching. "Heard that name. You're the one who burned down the cabin near Salt Creek, right?" I slowly lifted the glass of water, my voice cold. "I have paid the price. Even though I am not guilty, the jury thinks otherwise. It's funny how flexible guilt can be." The bartender snatched the glass back. "Go away. We don't serve criminals." My throat tightened. But I didn't plead. I just nodded, turned on my heel, and walked out the door. At that moment, a small, clear voice rang out from a corner of the room. "Hey!" A petite girl with long blonde hair and freckles like little stars was looking at me. The little girl held a ragged rag doll, her eyes big and round, looking up. "Do you want to meet my father?" My heart clenched. That question was like a bolt of lightning tearing through the darkness of indifference that had clung to me for so long. I frowned. "What?" "My daddy has horses," said the little girl, and pied. I looked back at the tavern door, then at the long road ahead. "I don't think your dad would want someone like me as a friend," I said. The little girl shrugged, innocently. "My dad won't mind. You look like you need a cape." I almost laughed, which startled me. It had been months since anything had made my lips twitch. The little girl held out her small, dusty hand. "I'm Laya." I hesitated. "Ellie." "Come on, Ellie. It's not far." I looked at the road. The sunlight seemed to punish me even more. Then looked at the girl who was talking as if she had known me for a long time. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a burden, a danger, or a name to be talked about behind my back. I reached out, took her little hand, and followed Laya towards the carriage tied behind the restaurant. "Does your dad know you're doing this?" I asked as I climbed into the car. Laya grinned. "No." We rolled into the scrubland, the town shrinking behind us. I glanced at the little girl beside me, who was humming an off-key tune, a bobbing rag doll in her tiny hand. I didn't know where we were going, but this felt more like a beginning than anything I'd left behind. The road to Carr Farm winds through pine-covered hills, the air getting cooler as we climb. I kept my hand close to the bag, scanning for signs of other people. Men with guns, barking dogs, things I had learned to anticipate. But the little girl next to her just swung her legs and pointed at the birds. "That's where my dad talks to the trees," Leia said, pointing to a clearing. "My dad says they hear better than people." I nodded, not knowing what to say. When we arrived, I almost missed the house. It was built low into the slope, long and wooden, with a moss-covered roof and a front porch that sagged slightly under the weight of time. Ivy coiled around the posts, a shutter hung askew, but the windows were clean. Leia jumped down and ran to the door without knocking. "Dad, I brought someone." I slowly got off the carriage, my boots crunching on the gravel. The door opened. Marshall Carr stood in the doorway. He was tall and thin in a gray flannel shirt and dark pants tucked into worn boots. His hair was shoulder length, black with streaks of ash at the temples. But it was his eyes that drew me in. Pale gray, almost silver, like smoke, just before it dissipated. He looked at me as one looks at a sudden storm, not with fear, but with the knowledge that it could change everything. "You're Ellie," he said. Not a question, right? "She was thirsty," Leia added. They threw her out again. Marshall's jaw clenched. "Come in." I didn't move. "Are you sure?" He nodded once. "No one gets evicted in this house." I walked in. The smell of pine and leather filled the air. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace. The room was empty but tidy. Old books on the mantelpiece. A rocking chair covered with a hand-tufted blanket. On the far wall, a framed photo of a woman smiled gently into the room. My eyes stopped on the picture. "My wife," said Marshall. There was no warmth in his voice, just a matter of fact. Leia tugged on his shirt. "Can she stay?" "Dad, just a moment." He did not answer immediately. "There's a storm coming tonight. The roads will be muddy." He turned to me. "You can stay in the guest room for a few days, then you will need to go and I nodded. That's fair. Leia ran to chase the dog in the yard. I stood still in the doorway, looking at the house. No women's shoes at the door. No new bed linen. But on the armrest of the rocking chair, a lace cloth remained, yellowed with time. In the corner of the kitchen, an upside-down teacup rests on a saucer, free of dust. The house is empty of gift, but not empty of memories. Are you keeping it? I asked softly. Marshall didn't look up. He poured coffee into two mismatched cups. She died 3 years ago, drowned near South Ridge. He handed me a cup. I'm at the law office in Sheridan. I took the coffee, but didn't drink it. Sorry. He nodded, and then silence. He sat down at the table and looked at the fire. I sat across from him, unsure whether I was being welcomed or judged. He didn't ask me where I was from. I didn't volunteer to say either. But as Laya's laughter echoed through the window and the storm gathered in the sky, I thought I saw it, just for a moment. As Laya passed by, her father's eyes followed her as they had once followed hope. And I wonder how much of the gray in his eyes comes from ash, and how much comes from regret. I settled into life at Carr Farm like trying on an old pair of boots. Slowly, tiredly. I woke up early, swept the porch, helped Marshall feed the pets. At first, Marshall just watched me without comment, arms crossed, expression unreadable. But he didn't stop me. Laya is always with me, with her freckles. The little girl asked hundreds of questions. Why is your hair red? Do you know how to ride a horse? Do you believe ghosts can cry? I answer what I can, laugh at what I can't. One afternoon, while cleaning out the back stables, I found a loose floorboard in the attic. Beneath, buried in the dust, was a small cloth-bound notebook with a faded pink ribbon. It was a diary. The first page read in neat handwriting, June Avery Carr. 1882. I hesitated, then turned the page. The early notes were simple, recipes, notes about Laya's first steps, a sketch of the stream that ran behind the house. Marshall will be in town overnight again. He says the company needs him more now. The house feels colder without him. But not just because of his absence. Another page. I thought I heard footsteps on the porch last night, but when I opened the door, there was nothing. Just the wind. However, I locked the nursery window. I turned quickly. My heart started pounding. An entry dated 3 years ago. 2 days before June's death, Marshall is away all week. I saw another horseman near the top of the mountain. Same horse, same hat. This time he didn't wave, just stared. There was a knock at the door last night. It wasn't Marshall. Too loud, too slow. A chill ran down my arm. Last item. Leia has a fever. I'll go get some fever reducer in the morning. If I'm not back before sunset, tell the little girl I sang to the tree. That was the day June's body was found, half submerged near the river. Investigators called it an accident, slip and drown. But I've seen women drown before. The bruises on their arms, the silence afterward. I flipped through the diary, my thoughts racing. Why is it hidden? I glanced out the window. Marshall was in the stables working the gray mare. Leia sat on the grass weaving flowers. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the wind playing on the wooden walls. The rocking chair in the living room creaked once, then fell silent, somewhere deep in the house. I thought I heard a door close softly. At breakfast, Marshall noticed the dark circles under my eyes. Are you okay? Did June write? I asked abruptly. He looked up. What? Your wife. Does she keep a diary? His fork paused in midair. I guess I never read it. She never mentioned feeling watched. He put down his fork. What are you asking me? Miss Hayes. I hesitated. You were in town the night she died. Right. Can anyone confirm that? Marshall's jaw clenched. You think I heard her? I think someone did. And I think she knew it was coming. Marshall slowly stood up. Did you find anything? I found her word. He looked at me for a long time, longer than he had ever looked before. Finally, his voice was soft. You should let this go. I stood up too. I can't. Leia ran into the room, panting. Look what I did. The little girl held up a crown of wildflowers. It's for Mom. I'll put it by the stream. Marshall's face softened. I will go with you. As they left, I looked again at the chair by the fire. The embroidered cloth still neatly placed. I don't believe in an empty house anymore, June. And now I wonder what else the house hid. I searched quietly, systematically, as if piecing together the pieces of a map that no one wanted to find. Every day after doing the housework, while Leia napped or played by the stream, I returned to the attic, the cellar, the forgotten corners of the farm where dust gathered like secrets. I moved like one who knows better than to make a sound, who has learned in captivity that the truth often lies hidden in silence. The old writing desk in the study creaked when I opened it. Its drawers had long since been emptied of ink and paper, leaving only the smell of cedar and stale smoke. But when I tapped the bottom, my knuckle hit a hollow resonance, a false bottom. I pried it open carefully, revealing a bundle of yellowed paper tied with a faded red string. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from something closer to awareness. This thread, this silence, felt too intentional. Among the documents was a sealed, thick, crisp envelope, still unopened. The name printed in neat block letters on the front almost took my breath away. To Mayor Horace Dayon, town of Dry Hollow. My fingers broke the seal slowly, solemnly. Inside was a letter dated 3 days before Junkar's death, which I began to read. Dear Mayor Dayon, I write not to beg, but to demand justice. A group of landowners led by Garvey Vanette has systematically manipulated the town's map to seize federal land, land that belongs to families who cannot afford lawyers or challenge it. The Hayes family estate is one of the first. Others will follow. This is no longer a legal issue. It is a moral issue. If you ignore this, you are complicit. Sincerely, June Carr. Below the conclusion is a legal seal, and below that, a signature, Marshall Carr. That name hit me like a rock. I slowly sat down, the edge of the bed barely keeping me upright. The letter trembled in my heart. It's true. It's all true. All the things I whispered to myself in the quiet darkness of my cell. What the prosecutor mocked as delusion. What my lawyer dismissed as hysteria. What no one believed when I spoke in court. The land I grew up on, my father's land, was taken away. My father was beaten for resisting. I went to fight to get it back. I stormed into the county recorder's office and threatened to burn it down. A week later, a fire broke out in the courthouse stable. I was blamed. There was no evidence, no witnesses, just anger and timing. 5 years in prison for arson and endangering public property. My arrest warrant bears a name, Marshall Carr, the very man whose daughter crawled into my lap, whose hands tended the fields beside me, whose silence I mistook for tenderness. I stood up, the letter pressed to my chest like a wound. I went to the window and pushed it open. Outside, the sun was just beginning to set behind the hills, casting a honey-colored light on the grass. I saw Marshall in the distance, leading a brown horse back to the stable. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbow, his hair black with sweat. He moved slowly, deliberately, and for the first time, I didn't see the man Laya called Dad. I saw the man who signed my conviction. I turned away from the window. My hands quickly packed the few things I had: worn boots, a cotton shawl, a bag, a diary, and a letter. I crept down the stairs, every board creaking under my feet. In the living room, Laya's doll lies curled up on the fireplace. I stopped long enough to straighten its woolly hair. Then I slipped across to the back porch, where the wind had begun to blow. I walked, slowly at first, then faster. The letter was pressed against my side, the truth pressed against my flesh. Behind me, the lights in the house came on. I don't look back. Dry Hollow Town Hall lies there like a forgotten relic. Its wood was faded, the windows covered with dust. I approached with the heavy caution of someone returning to a place that had turned his life upside down. Inside, the air was thick with silence and the smell of rotting paper. I walked past the empty clerk's station toward the back storage room, where a dim light shone. I hear footsteps. A voice called out from the darkness. An old man stood up from behind a pile of boxes, gaunt, with a white beard, glasses pushed up on the bridge of his nose. "Oh, I'll be Eleanor Hayes." I stiffened. "I remember your trial," he said without malice. "The town turned on you so quickly. Always think there is more. Do you still have the council records?" I asked. He nodded slowly, not aloud. "But I have a habit of keeping." I took the letter out of my pocket. The one June Carr wrote. His eyes narrowed as he scanned it. June, smart girl. Too smart. She came here too. Right before she died, she said she had evidence that the council was transferring land back to Vanette and his group. She died before she could send this. He swallowed. "Yeah, and you. You are caught in the same trap." I clenched my fist. "I want to see the records. All of them." He looked around, lowering his voice. "Umbihas ones. Come with me." They went down to a storage room lined with filing cabinets. He opened one marked Zoning and Legal, 1880 and 1880. "Here," he said, pulling out a folder marked Top Secret, City Security Assessment. Inside were memos, land survey amendments, maps redrawn in red ink, legal complaints dismissed without a hearing. and a court document, mine, an arrest warrant for Eleanor Hayes, filed by the city attorney, approved by the city council Marshall Carr. But look here, the old man pointed, tapping the margin. See this? A faded for the eyes of the council-only seal. Back then, he explained, they started marking certain legal cases as security threats to prevent the details from circulating. It meant that signatories, like Marshall, weren't allowed to read the contents before confirming receipt of the procedure. My chest rose, then slowly fell. He never knew what he signed. The old man nodded solemnly. The council pushed a lot of things through that trick. Your land, other families. June Carr was digging into it. That's why they shut her out. So it was all a lie, I whispered. He closed the file. You're not the first person they've tried to bury, but maybe you'll be the last one not buried. I stared at the documents in my hand, my breath shaky. The man reached into a drawer and handed me a sealed envelope. She left this, he said. June said if anything happened to her, to give it to someone who could still make noise. I took it carefully. Then I turned back, my eyes now filled with determination. I am no longer a ghost, and I am not alone in the dark. The sun was setting behind the mountains as I returned to Carr Farm. My boots were dusty, my shoulders were straight, but my heart was still unsteady. Each step seemed heavier than the last, not from fatigue, but from the burden of all I had just known. The wooden fence appeared, just as a small figure rushed toward me. Ellie, Laya's voice rang out like wind chimes in the silence. The little girl threw herself at my legs, hugging me tightly, her face buried in the dusty folds of my skirt. I knew you would come back. I told the chickens you would. I knelt down, put my arms around the baby, and held it tight. They clucked twice, Laya said seriously. It means yeah, I chuckled, panting. Smart birds. From the porch, Marshall stood silently. His figure was motionless, almost carved into the sunset. His eyes found me across the yard. He said nothing, made no gesture, but the wind carried something between us that words only weakened. The front door was open just enough to let in the light. Inside, I found a neatly folded wool blanket placed on a rocking chair near the fireplace. A tin plate covering something that smelled of warm cornbread, and a neat stack of freshly cut wood placed next to the stove. Not a welcome, but a home waiting to be rebuilt. I walked in and felt the air change, as if a storm had swept through and cleaned everything, leaving only the smell of pine and rising breath. I haven't talked about what I learned at City Hall. Not yet, not while the dust is still settling inside me. The following days passed without incident. The chickens were fed, the horses were groomed, water was carried, and the west fence was repaired. I worked with Marshall. Simple work, few words. I do it not because I owe it to anyone, but because that rhythm steadies me, as if the land itself is reminding me to breathe again. Laya followed me everywhere, her voice as soft as the wind. At night, I sat near the fireplace, writing in the pages of June Carr's notebook. The leather cover was worn, the ink faded, but the words were still fresh under my fingertips. I still haven't decided what to do with the letter June wrote, the letter she never got to send. Then one evening it happened. I was pulling a tray of cookies out of the cast iron oven when the edge of the tray caught my hand. The pain came immediately and sharply. Cutting through my palm, my jaw dropped. The tray of cakes slipped from my hands and fell to the floor. The cake batter scattered, sizzling as it hit the hot stone. I muttered a curse under my breath and backed away. Reaching for a towel, before I could move, a figure flashed across the room. Marshall was there. He knelt down beside me, gently took my injured hand, and led me to the sink. No words, no fuss, just quiet, intentional care. He poured cool water on the burn, his other hand holding mine tight. Then from his shirt pocket, he pulled out a piece of linen and carefully wrapped it around my palm. You didn't deserve this, he said softly, and neither did she. I looked up, startled by the weight in his voice. For the first time, he didn't avoid my eyes. He is facing it. I swallowed. You were in on him. His eyes flashed with pain, unintentional. But yeah, I waited for the fire in my chest to flare up again. For the bitterness, it didn't come. He reached out and took my other hand, unburned, undefended, and held it. Not tight, just enough. I can't undo what happened, he said, his voice echoing low. But I can guarantee what happens next will be different. I stared at him for a long breath, then nodded. That night I slept under the roof he had repaired, my hands wrapped in linen, and my heart wrapped in something gentler. Marshall Carr didn't say any great apologies or love, but in his silence, I heard something equally powerful. a beginning. Spring slowly crept into the bones of Dry Hollow, bringing with it new green buds on the cottonwoods and the smell of fresh earth after a rain. At Carr Farm, the ground softened, and so do the people. I stay. I start my morning with black coffee and bread dough, my afternoon with chalk and paper, with boards salvaged from an old fence, and the stubbornness that only a woman tempered by fire can bring. I transformed the empty stable loft into a study. I painted a sign in crooked letters, Carr Hollow Learning Corner. It's not grand, but it's real. The children came in pairs and threes, barefoot, sunburned, hesitant at first. Some carried only a stick as a pencil. Others carried a desire for something beyond survival. I taught them letters, then words, then story. I show them how to hold a pencil as if it were power. I teach them how to sign as if they were planting root. Leah became my maid, my shadow. Her voice when mine was too hoarse to use. The townspeople, who had been whispering behind curtained windows, began nodding as I passed the general store. Some even smiled and wore hats. They no longer call me the woman in prison or Marshall Carr's tramp. They called me Miss Ellie, who baked cakes and taught their children to read under the cottonwoods. One bright afternoon, while cleaning the main room of the house, I found Leah hunched over the dining table with strawberry-stained fingers and worn crayons. She had drawn something clumsy in form but vivid in meaning. "That's us," Leah said proudly, holding up the picture. "See, that's you, and that's June's mother. They were both keeping the farm like this." She spread her arms wide so it wouldn't fall. I held the picture and stared at it, my throat closing up. Two women, one in memory, one in flesh and blood, both cherishing a single home between them, past and present. Grief and grace, sketched by the hand of a child. That weekend, Marshall did something I never expected. I walked into the living room, still dusting flour off my apron, and froze. My breath caught at my throat. Over the fireplace, where there had been only one picture frame for 3 years, now hung two. On the left, a soft brown portrait of June Carr, her face calm, her eyes like distant rain. On the right, a new photo. I smiled widely, hair flying in the wind. Leah perched like a star on my shoulder. The photo was taken a few weeks ago under the cotton tree where June used to sit and write. Below the two picture frames is a small, polished brass plaque. It reads, "The Carr house is lit by her, warmed by her." I stepped back, stunned. My hands trembled on my skirt. That simple act unlocked something in my chest that had been locked away for so long. I said nothing, just turned, opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, my heart heavy and light at the same time. Marshall followed shortly after, his boots clicking lightly on the wooden floor. He stood beside me as the sun set behind the pine-covered hills, the sky flushed with gold and lilacs. "I don't know if that's the right thing to do," he said, his voice low and uncertain. "Yeah," I whispered. "You didn't choose between us. You honored both." He nodded slowly. "She is the fire," he said. "But you're the one who kept it alive." Tears welled up before I could stop them. I looked at him, not with gratitude or confusion, but with the quiet understanding of one who has finally been seen, whole and unburdened. No one said the word love. No one needed to. Not that night. The land, the house, the girl, the man, all had changed subtly, but forever. And as laughter spilled from the kitchen behind, and the stars flashed one by one, Ellie Hayes stood in the car doorway and saw herself at last not as a guest, not as a burden, not as a ghost of a story long buried, but as the heart, as the one who stayed, as the one who warmed, as the keeper of the light. A year has passed since Ellie Hayes first set foot on Carr Farm with dust on her boots and nowhere to belong. The seasons have done their work, softening the sharp edges, turning the hard soil into blooming flowers. Spring gave way to summer to harvest, and now the lilacs tremble again in the morning dew. The papers were signed at City Hall last week. Legal custody is granted to Eleanor Hayes Carr, the judge said, sealing the document with a final thud. Leah is officially mine. That night, as I tucked her into bed, Leah reached out, her little hand touching my cheek. "Are you really my mother?" she whispered. I nodded, my eyes sparkling. "Yeah, honey, I've always been your mother. It's just on paper now." In the months leading up to that, Marshall and I had built more than a family. We had turned the old warehouse into a small store, Carr Hollow Goods. There I sold loaves of honey bread wrapped in linen and jars of dried herbs I harvested myself. Rosemary, marigolds, daisy. Marshall raised chickens and bees, bringing in eggs and jars of amber honey. He built wooden shelves and painted a simple sign that read, "Made from the earth for those who stay." It became a quiet success, not huge, but steady. People stopped by on their way to town, not just to shop, but to feel something authentic. Then, one late October afternoon, Marshall led me across the fields to the edge of the property, where the land sloped down to a pine grove. The air was fresh, with a faint smell of resin and cedar. He stopped under the largest tree, its bark gray with age. "This is hers," he said. Kneeling at the base of the tree, "June planted rosemary here every spring. It drives away evil spirit." I looked down. Fresh rosemary now grows in neat rows around the trunk. "She was right," I said softly. Marshall stood up and turned to me. In his hand was a simple leather strap. Hanging from it was a small silver pendant, worn at the edges, shaped like a flame. He held it out. "It's not fancy, but it's real." I took it, my fingers trembling. Engraved in small letters, "No longer passing by." I blinked back tears. "You did this," he shrugged, his voice hoarse. "Someone helped make the silver. But the words, they come from here." He patted his chest. I looked at him for a long time, then reached out and took his hand. "I was blamed for the fire," I said, my voice choking. "But maybe I was meant to bring light." He pulled me into his arms. Slowly and surely, we stood together under the pine tree, the ghost of the past behind, the new roots below. That weekend, Marshall carved a new sign for the front gate. He polished it smooth, covered it with beeswax, and hung it where all visitors could see it. The words are carved deep into the wood grain. "Here there are no ghosts, only love remains." And on evenings when the wind was gentle and laughter echoed from the kitchen window, travelers would pass by the farm and stop, not to ask for directions, not to find shelter, but to catch a glimpse of something real. Not a woman who passed by, but one who stayed. She walked in a stranger, dusty and forgotten. She remained as a mother, a companion, a flame that never went out. Some love stories are born in grand ballrooms, but the truest stories are carved in pine, whispered in the kitchen, and found in the eyes of a child who simply says, "Do you want to meet my daddy?"